The champagne tasted like victory, or at least what I imagined victory tasted like. It was crisp, effervescent, and danced on my tongue with a joyful carelessness that mirrored the atmosphere in the grand ballroom. Crystal chandeliers, heavy as frozen waterfalls, dripped light onto the polished marble floors. The air hummed with the low thrum of 100 conversations, a symphony of power, influence, and expertly feigned interest. This was the annual St. Jude's Foundation Gala, the glittering apex of the city's social calendar, and my husband, Liam, was the man of the hour. His firm, Sterling Vance Architecture, had designed the new pediatric wing pro bono. A project of immense scale and heart, it had cemented his reputation not just as a brilliant architect, but as a pillar of the community. I watched him from across the room, a tall, steady figure in a perfectly tailored tuxedo. He was engaged in conversation with the mayor, his smile practiced but, I thought, genuinely warm. My heart swelled with a familiar, potent pride. This was the man I had married. Kind, driven, and achingly handsome. He was my rock, my anchor in a world that often felt too fast and too loud. I smoothed down the silk of my emerald green dress, feeling a thrill of belonging. For years, we had been on the outside look. Now we were here. We were in. I took another sip of champagne and let my gaze drift around the room, cataloging the city's elite. The banking tycoons, the tech billionaires, the old money matriarchs draped in heirloom jewels. And then, my eyes landed on him. Julian Croft. If Liam was the rising sun of our city's architectural scene, Julian Croft was the established, blazing noon. He was older, impossibly charismatic, with a mane of silver hair and a smile that could disarm armies. His firm, Croft Designs, was the Goliath to Liam's David, though tonight, it felt like David had finally landed a decisive blow. Julian stood near the orchestra, holding court, a glass of dark liquor in his hand. He was laughing, a deep, resonant sound that carried across the room, but his eyes, when they briefly met mine, were as cold and hard as chips of obsidian. I had never liked Julian. Liam was always professionally courteous, but I could sense a deeper, colder current beneath the surface. He called it professional rivalry, the natural tension between the top two firms in the city. But it always felt more personal to me. There was a story there, one Liam never fully shared, about their early days, a partnership that had soured. Ancient history, Alara, he would say, waving it away with a hand. Let's focus on the future. And tonight, the future looked dazzling. I excused myself from a conversation with a tedious city councilman's wife and began to weave my way through the crowd towards Liam. I wanted to feel his arm around my waist, to share in his triumph up close. The orchestra swelled, launching into a Vivaldi piece, and the joyful noise washed over me. As I drew closer, I saw Julian Croft detach from his group and approach my husband. The mayor, sensing the shift in energy, offered a final handshake and moved on, leaving them alone. I slowed my pace, suddenly hesitant to interrupt. From a distance, it looked like a scene of professional grace. Julian clapped a hand on Liam's shoulder. He was likely offering congratulations, a sportsmanlike acknowledgement of his rival's success. I saw Liam nod, his expression unreadable from this distance. Julian leaned in, said something close to Liam's ear, and then threw his head back and laughed again. But this time the laugh seemed different, sharper, more pointed. Liam didn't laugh. He stood perfectly still, a statue carved from granite. And then I saw it, the subtle clenching of his jaw, the way his hand, hanging by his side, curled into a tight, white-knuckled fist. A chill, sudden and unwelcome, snaked its way up my spine, cutting through the warmth of the champagne. Something was wrong. Julian gave Liam's shoulder one last patronizing pat and turned away, melting back into the crowd. I started forward again, my steps quickening with concern. Liam? Honey, is everything all right? I asked, reaching for his arm. His muscles were rigid, coiled tight as a spring. He didn't look at me. His eyes, a deep, warm hazel I knew as well as my own, were fixed on Julian Croft's retreating back. They were flat, devoid of any light or warmth, like a winter sea. "Liam!" I tried again, my voice softer. He blinked, as if surfacing from a great depth. He turned to me, and for a fleeting second he looked like a stranger. The public smile was gone, replaced by a mask of cold, hard focus. He took my arm, his grip much tighter than necessary. "We're leaving," he said. His voice was a low, guttural command. It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't a request. "Leaving? But Liam, the night's just getting started. You haven't even given your speech yet. People are still arriving." My mind raced, trying to understand the sudden shift. Had Julian said something to upset him? An insult? A threat? "What did he say to you?" "Not here." The words were clipped, final. He started pulling me towards the exit, his strides long and purposeful. I had to practically jog in my heels to keep up. Heads turned. I saw the confused, curious glances of our friends and colleagues. I could feel my cheeks flush with embarrassment. We were meant to be the gracious hosts, the celebrated couple. Instead, my husband was dragging me out of our own victory party like a criminal. "Liam, please, you're making a scene." I hissed, trying to pull my arm free, but his grip was like iron. He didn't seem to notice or care about the stairs. His focus was singular, directed entirely on the grand archway that led to the lobby. "Let them watch," he muttered, his voice so low I barely heard it. The valet, a young man with wide, startled eyes, scrambled to fetch our car as Liam pushed through the revolving doors into the cool night air. The cacophony of the party faded behind us, replaced by the distant sounds of city traffic and the frantic beating of my own heart. I was a tempest of emotions. Confusion, anger, humiliation, and a deep, gnawing worry for my husband. I had never seen him like this. Never. The controlled, patient man I loved had been replaced by this silent, seething force. We stood on the curb in a suffocating silence. He had released my arm, but he stood close, a palpable aura of tension radiating from him. He stared down the street, waiting for the sleek, black silhouette of his Audi to appear. "Will you please tell me what is going on?" I demanded, my voice trembling with a mixture of fear and frustration. "You can't just drag me out of there without a single word of explanation." "That was Julian, wasn't it? What did that bastard say to you?" He didn't answer. He just continued to stare into the darkness, his jaw working silently. I felt a surge of helplessness. I was his wife. We were partners. We didn't have secrets, or so I had believed. This wall of silence he had erected was more frightening than any argument. Finally, the car pulled up. The valet, trying to be professional, held the passenger door for me. I slid in, my silk dress feeling cold and foreign against my skin. Liam tipped the young man a shockingly generous amount. I noticed with a detached sense of surprise and got in behind the wheel. He started the engine, but he didn't put the car in gear. He just sat there, his hands gripping the steering wheel, the leather creaking under the pressure. The opulent lights of the gala hall glowed in the rearview mirror, a world away. The silence in the car was a physical entity. It was heavier than the chandeliers, deeper than the orchestra's bass notes. Pressed in on me, making it hard to breathe. I waited. I counted the seconds in my head, each one stretching into an eternity. My mind replayed the scene over and over. Julian's laugh, Liam's fist, the coldness in his eyes. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, he let out a long, slow breath. It was not a sigh of relief, but the exhalation of a man who had been holding his breath for a very, very long time. He turned his head slowly and looked at me. The streetlights cast his face in a stark chiaroscuro of light and shadow. The anger was gone, replaced by something I couldn't name. It was a profound, weary stillness, an emptiness. "You really didn't see it, did you?" His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, yet it filled the car, heavy with the weight of unspoken history. I stared back at him, completely and utterly lost. "See what?" I asked, my own voice a faint echo. "See what, Liam? I saw Julian upset you. I saw you get angry. What else was there to see? A small, mirthless smile touched his lips. It didn't reach his eyes. Alara, my brilliant, beautiful Alara, you were watching the wrong man. You were watching me. You should have been watching him. Julian? What about him? He was laughing. He looked like he was on top of the world. Yes, Liam said, his voice laced with a strange, dark satisfaction. He did. For a moment. The last moment he'll ever have like that. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. You didn't see the slight tremor in his hand as he picked up his glass after he spoke to me? The way his gaze darted towards his CFO, Marcus Thorne, who was standing by the bar. The way Thorne, after a quick glance at his phone, suddenly went pale and made a beeline for the exit. I frowned, trying to recall the details, but it was all a blur of faces and noise.
No.
I didn't notice any of that. What does it mean? You didn't see the reporter from the Financial Times, a woman I've been feeding anonymous tips to for 6 months, position herself right beside Julian's biggest investors? Or the federal investigator, masquerading as a wine distributor, making quiet conversation with Julian's head of accounting? My blood ran cold. Federal investigator? Liam, what are you talking about? What have you done? He turned fully in his seat, his eyes finally locking onto mine with a burning intensity. The emptiness was gone, replaced by a fire that had been banked for years, a terrifying, triumphant blaze. What I've done, he repeated, his voice dangerously soft. I've spent the last 10 years of my life building a stage, a beautiful, gilded stage. Sterling Vance, our home, our reputation, this entire night. It was all just scaffolding. And tonight, at the height of his arrogance, in a room full of everyone he's ever wanted to impress, Julian Croft finally stepped into the trapdoor. I couldn't speak. My throat was tight with dread. The man sitting next to me was a complete stranger. The kind, patient architect had vanished, and in his place was a meticulous, cold-blooded plotter. What Julian said to me, Liam continued, his voice hardening with the memory, was, "You've done well for yourself, Liam. It's almost enough to make me forget you started with nothing. But remember, a foundation built on sand will always wash away. He thinks he's the storm. He has no idea that the tide has already gone out." He reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a sleek, silver tablet. He tapped the screen, and it illuminated his face with a cold, blue light. He angled it towards me. It was a live newsfeed. The headline was stark: Croft Designs in Freefall. CEO Julian Croft accused of massive fraud. Embezzlement. Stock plummets 80% in after-hours trading. Below it, a cascade of smaller alerts. Breaking. Anonymous leak reveals decades of faked engineering reports on major city projects. Source. Evidence suggests Croft stole foundational designs from former partner. Exclusive. Federal warrants being issued for Croft, CFO Marcus Thorne, and other top executives. I stared at the screen, my mind refusing to process the words. This wasn't happening. This was a nightmare. This was the work of a phantom, a ghost. But the ghost was sitting right next to me. "It wasn't one thing, Alara," Liam said, his voice now calm, almost serene. "It was everything." It was the synchronized press release that went out to every major news outlet at 9:15 p.m. It was the encrypted data packet containing his offshore accounts, his cooked books, and his incriminating emails that was delivered to the U.S. Attorney's office at 9:16 p.m. It was the algorithm I paid a fortune for that initiated a massive short sell of his stock at 9:17 p.m., triggered by keywords in the initial news alerts. It was the complete, systematic, and public annihilation of his entire life. I looked from the tablet back to his face. The pride I had felt just an hour ago had curdled into a thick, sickening horror. The man I loved, the man I had built a life with, was capable of this. This
Intricate, monstre ou destruction.
Why? The word was a choked whisper. Liam. Why? He finally put the car in gear and pulled away from the curb, driving slowly into the city's glittering, indifferent night. His profile was a sharp silhouette against the passing lights. He didn't just steal a business from me, Elara. When he framed me, when he ruined my name all those years ago, my father lost everything, the stress, the humiliation. Put him in the hospital. He had a heart attack a week later. He died believing his only son was a failure and a criminal. He paused, his knuckles white on the steering wheel again. Julian Croft took my future and he took my father. I told myself that one day, I would take everything from him. Not just his money, not just his company. I wanted to take his name. I wanted to take his legacy. I wanted him to stand in the rubble of his life and know that I was the one who lit the match. We drove in silence for a few more blocks, the news alerts on the tablet continuing to flash. Each one another blow landing on a man who didn't even know the fight had begun. The champagne I'd drunk earlier was a sour, acidic presence in my stomach. The victory I had tasted was not mine. It was his, and it was born of a hatred so deep and patient it terrified me to my very soul. I looked at my husband, at the clean lines of his jaw, the determined set of his mouth, the chilling calm in his eyes. He had avenged his father. He had reclaimed his honor. He had orchestrated a revenge so perfect, so absolute, that it was a work of art, a terrifying masterpiece of ruin. And I, his loving wife, had been living with the artist for 8 years, sleeping next to him, sharing my life with him, completely oblivious to the masterpiece he was creating in the shadows. I hadn't seen a thing. The drive home was a journey through a new, alien landscape. The familiar streets of our city, the ones we'd navigated countless times on the way to dinner parties or lazy Sunday brunches, now seemed menacing, each street lamp a potential spotlight, each shadow a hiding place for a secret. The silence in the car was no longer just heavy. It was suffocating, filled with the ghost of a man I thought I knew and the terrifying reality of the man sitting beside me. Liam drove with an unnerving calm, his movements precise and economical, as if he were merely commuting home from a normal day at the office and not from the public execution of his lifelong nemesis. I remained mute, my mind a maelstrom of shock and horror. My thoughts were a chaotic slideshow. Julian Croft's arrogant laugh, the cold blue light of the tablet, the memory of Liam's father, a kind, gentle man with flour on his hands from his weekend baking, fading away in a sterile hospital bed. The juxtaposition of that gentle memory with the brutal, calculated reality of tonight was a cognitive dissonance so profound it made me physically ill. When we pulled into the driveway of our Hausia modern masterpiece of glass, steel, and cedar that Liam himself had designed, it looked different. It had always been my sanctuary, a symbol of our shared success and love. Tonight it felt like a fortress, command center, the gilded cage Liam had built to hide his true war. He killed the engine, and in the sudden, profound quiet, I could hear the frantic chirping of the news alerts from the tablet still resting on the center console. Each one felt like a shovelful of dirt being tossed onto Julian Croft's freshly dug grave. "Come inside," Liam said. It wasn't a request. His tone was still maddeningly placid, the voice of a man in total control. I followed him numbly, my emerald silk dress rustling like dead leaves. He unlocked the front door and stepped inside, disarming the security system with a familiar beep. The house was dark, save for the soft moonlight filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows in the living room. But Liam didn't turn on the main lights. He walked past the living room, past our beautiful open-plan kitchen, and headed towards the back of the house to his study. It was the one room in the house that was exclusively his. He called it his creative space, a place where he could work on designs late into the night. I had always respected his privacy, rarely entering. I'd imagined it filled with architectural models, blueprints, and books on structural engineering. The reality was something else entirely. He pushed the door open and flicked on a single desk lamp. The room was not what I expected. It was stark, minimalist, and chillingly organized. And one entire wall, the largest wall in the room, was not covered in bookshelves. It was covered in a sprawling, intricate web of information, a vast collage of vengeance. I stepped inside, my breath catching in my throat. It was like stepping into the mind of a predator. A massive corkboard, at least 15 feet long and 8 feet high, dominated the space. In the dead center was a large, glossy photograph of Julian Croft, smiling at some long-forgotten event. From this central image, a spiderweb of red and black threads radiated outwards, connecting to dozens of other photographs, documents, index cards, and scribbled notes. It was a blueprint of a man's life, deconstructed and weaponized. There were pictures of his wife, his children, his business partners, his golfing buddies. There were satellite images of his homes, the city penthouse, the country estate, the villa in Tuscany. There were corporate org charts with certain names circled in red. There were financial statements, property deeds, and what looked like leaked internal memos, all held in place by colored pins. A timeline ran along the bottom, meticulously marked with key dates stretching back over a decade. The last date on the timeline was today. It was marked with a single, stark word: checkmate. I walked closer, my horror deepening with every step. This wasn't a recent obsession. This was a life's work. The paper on some of the older notes was yellowed at the edges. The ink had faded. This wasn't the act of a man who had snapped. This was the slow, patient, methodical work of a master strategist. 10 years, Liam said from behind me. His voice was quiet, matter-of-fact. 10 years, 3 months, and 22 days since my father's funeral. That's how long it took. He walked over to the board, his posture betraying not a hint of shame or madness. He looked at it with the pride of a painter examining his finished canvas. I knew I couldn't beat him at his own game right away. He was too big, too established. He'd built his empire on my stolen plans, on a foundation of lies, but it was a solid empire nonetheless. So I had to build my own. He pointed to a section of the board dedicated to his own firm. Sterling Vance. I built it to be the best. Not just good. The best. I needed a reputation that was beyond reproach. I needed the influence, the connections. Every project, every award, every charity gala. It was all a means to an end. It was about getting into the same room as him. It was about earning the trust of people he trusted. My mind reeled. Our life, our shared accomplishments. Had it all been a lie? A tool for his revenge? Our life was not a lie, Alara, he said, as if reading my thoughts. His eyes softened for the first time that night as he turned to look at me. You were never a means to an end. You were the reason I could do this. You were the only part of my life that wasn't about him. You were my peace, my sanctuary, keeping you separate from. This, he gestured to the terrifying wall, was the hardest thing I've ever done. It was the only way to protect you. If he had ever suspected, he would have come after you to get to me. The sincerity in his voice was a lifeline, and I clung to it, but the chilling wall of evidence was impossible to ignore. He turned back to his masterpiece of ruin. The plan had 3 phases, he said, his voice shifting back to the cool, detached tone of a lecturer. Financial, professional, and social. I had to destroy him on every front simultaneously. A single attack would have been survivable, but a 3-pronged assault. There's no recovery from that. He tapped a cluster of documents related to offshore banking. Phase 1, financial. Julian was greedy, but he was also lazy. He used the same accountant for his personal and corporate finances for 20 years. A man named Arthur Pym. Pym was loyal, but he had a weakness. His daughter was sick, rare genetic disorder, treatments costing a fortune. I found out about it through a friend at the hospital. I set up an anonymous trust, funded it, and arranged for the money to find its way to Pym, disguised as a grant from a medical research foundation I created for that single purpose. After 2 years of anonymous help, I made contact. I didn't threaten him. I just presented the evidence I already had of his own complicity in Julian's tax evasion. I gave him a choice: a long prison sentence or full immunity and a new life in exchange for his cooperation. He gave me everything. Every offshore account, every shell corporation, every dirty transaction for the last 2 decades. He moved his finger along a red thread to another section. Phase 2. Professional. This was my favorite part. The original designs for the waterfront tower, the ones he stole from me. I still had my early drafts, my notebooks, dated and watermarked. But that wasn't enough. I needed to prove he used them. Over the years, I made sure my firm bid on and won contracts to do retrofits and safety inspections on several of his older buildings. My teams went in, and under the guise of routine work, they used ground-penetrating radar and material analysis to get the true as-built specifications. They matched my original designs perfectly. The final piece was tonight's project. The St. Jude's Wing. I designed it with a specific revolutionary structural support system, a system I had described in detail in my original stolen notebooks. For the last 6 months, I've had a disgruntled ex-employee of mine leak information to a prominent architectural blogger that Croft was planning to use a similar system in his upcoming skyscraper project. Julian, being the arrogant fool he is, took the bait. He announced it last week. He publicly laid claim to an idea I could prove was mine from 15 years ago. He walked right into it. My stomach churned. The beautiful pediatric wing, a project I thought was born of pure altruism, was also a weapon. A lure in a decade-long trap. Finally, Liam said, his hand hovering over photos from parties, golf tournaments, and society events. Phase 3. Social. This was the easiest. Men like Julian have no real friends, only allies and sycophants. All you have to do is make him look weak. I gathered evidence of everything. His affairs, his gambling debts, the way he cheated his partners. I fed it piece by piece to the city's biggest gossips, the rivals he'd snubbed, the people who smiled to his face but sharpened their knives behind his back. I didn't release it myself. I just made sure the right people had the ammunition. Tonight, when the news of his financial ruin broke, his friends were the first to twist the knife. They're not just abandoning a sinking ship, they're helping to sink it, to pick at the scraps. He stepped back from the board, a deep, profound sense of finality in his posture. It's over. By morning, his assets will be frozen. The board will have fired him. The Architectural Guild will begin proceedings to strip his license. His wife, who I made sure received a portfolio of his infidelities an hour ago, is probably meeting with her divorce lawyer as we speak. He's not just ruined Elara. He's been erased. The room was silent again, save for the low hum of the computer on his desk. I stared at the wall, at the intricate, terrifying tapestry of his vengeance. I understood the why. God, I understood it. The pain of losing his father, the injustice of it all. It was a wound that would never truly heal. I could even, in a dark, secret corner of my heart, feel a grim satisfaction that Julian Croft was getting what he deserved. But the how was monstrous. The cold patience, the meticulous detail, the manipulation of dozens of lives, treating people like pawns on a chessboard. The man who did this was not the warm, loving husband I thought I knew. He was a stranger, a brilliant, patient, and utterly ruthless stranger. Was I just a cover? I finally whispered, the question tearing at my throat. Was our entire marriage just part of your disguise? The happy, successful architect with his loving wife. He turned to me, and for the first time I saw a crack in his serene facade. I saw a flicker of pain, of genuine hurt. He crossed the room in 2 strides and took my hands. His were cold. No, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Never. Elara, look at me. I forced myself to meet his gaze. Everything on that wall was about the past. It was about closing a door. You were always about the future. You were the only thing that kept me human through all of this. Loving you was the only thing that wasn't part of the plan. His phone buzzed on his desk. Then mine lit up on the kitchen counter. The news was spreading. The world we had so carefully built was now inextricably linked to the world Liam had just destroyed. Friends would be calling, confused, shocked. Some would be offering support, others seeking gossip. Our life would never be the same. Liam ignored the buzzing. He kept his eyes on me. The monster that built that wall. The one who lived in the shadows for 10 years. He's gone now, Alara. He served his purpose. It's over. All that's left is me. The man who loves you. He stood before me, stripped bare. He had revealed his deepest, darkest secret. The architect of a man's ruin, now asking if the foundation of our own life was strong enough to withstand the truth. He had won his war, but the final, most important battle was here, now, in this room. And he didn't know if he would win it. I looked from his face, so full of desperate hope, to the monstrous wall behind him. I thought of our laughter, our struggles, our quiet moments of love. Were they real? Or were they just the brief, sunlit moments in a long, dark story of revenge? He had killed a part of himself to do this, and now he was asking me to love the man who was left. I didn't have an answer. The victory champagne had long since turned to ash in my mouth. I pulled my hands from his, the silence in the room stretching into a vast, uncertain chasm between us. I looked at the man I had married, the architect of a ruin and a potential future, and I knew that our own foundation had been shaken to its core. The silence that followed was heavier than any word he could have spoken.